One of the very important concepts in CSS is the concept of box model, which means whenever the browser renders an element, it puts that element inside an invisible box. At the core of this box, we have the content area. This is where our content is displayed. So if you have a paragraph element with some text, our text is shown here. Outside of the content area, we have the padding area, which is used for adding some space outside of the content area. Next, we have the border area. So if you have a border, the border is shown here. And finally, we have the margin area, which is used to add some space in between different elements. This is what we call the box model. Now let's see this in action. So let's define a paragraph element with some text. Here's what we get. Now let's inspect this element. Note that when I hover my mouse over this element in the DOM, this element is going to get highlighted. Take a look. So this is the box model. At the core, we have the blue area, which is the content area. And outside of that, we have the orange area, which is the margin area. In this example, we don't have the padding and border areas because we haven't set them. We'll get there in a second. Now, how do I know which color represents which area? Well, we have a legend here. So look at the Styles tab down the bottom. Here's our legend. So blue represents the content area. And over here, we can see the size of this area. So our content area is 531 pixels wide and 18 pixels high. Outside of the content area, we have the padding area, which is empty. We also have the border area, which is empty. And finally, we can see the margin area, which has 16 pixels margin on top and bottom and no margins on left and right. Now, where do these numbers come from? Well, 16 pixels is assigned by Chrome by default. Other browsers may assign different values for the margin area, but most browsers use 16 pixels for top and bottom margins. Now let's see how we can use CSS to control the size of these areas. So let's define a rule for our paragraph element and set the padding property. Here we can supply 4 values just like the border property. So we have top, right, bottom, and left. So I'm going to go with 10, 20, 10, 20, or turbo, right? Now, if we don't supply the last value, this last value is for what? Left padding. If we don't supply this, the browser will use the value for right padding, which is 20 pixels. So whether we type this or not is not going to make a difference. Now, similarly, if we don't supply the last value, this last value is for what? Bottom padding. So if we don't supply this, the browser will use the value for top padding, which is 10 pixels. So 1020 is the short form of writing 1020, 1020. Now, if you have 2 values, the first value represents the vertical padding, whereas the second value represents horizontal padding. Now, let's give this element a border of 5 pixels, solid, gold. So here's what we get. Note that the padding is the space between the border and the content area, whereas margin is the space outside of the border. So we use margin to space elements, okay? Now, look at our legend again. In the padding area, we have 20 pixels horizontal padding and 10 pixels vertical padding. And because of this left padding, our text has shifted 20 pixels to the right? Now we can change these values directly here. So we can double click here and change the left padding to 0. Now our text moved to the left. Just remember, any changes we make here are applied as inline styles to DOM elements. So here's our paragraph element. As you can see, the padding left property is applied as an inline style, okay? So the changes are purely in the DOM. They're not reflected in our HTML or CSS code. So this is the idea of the box model. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know how to use the padding and margin properties properly, and that's why they end up with a lot of issues in their layouts. So let me clarify this once for all. So first, I'm going to duplicate this paragraph element so we can see 2 elements next to each other. Now, let's get rid of the border property and set the padding to 20 pixels and margin to 0. So we want to get rid of the default margin that the browser applies, okay? Let's see what we get. So we have 2 paragraph elements. Now, I'm going to hover over each of these elements, and I want you to pay close attention to the padding area. So here's the first element. Below the content area, we have 20 pixels bottom padding, right? Now I'm going to hover the second element. Above the content area, we have 20 pixels top padding. So what is the actual space between these 2 elements? It's 20 pixels plus 20 pixels, which is 40 pixels, okay? Now, let's replace padding with margin and set padding to 0. Let's see what we get. You can immediately see that these elements are closer. This is what we call margin collapsing. If you have two elements next to each other, their margins get collapsed into a single margin. So look at the first element. We have 20 pixels bottom margin. Now look at the second element. We have 20 pixels top margin, but the top margin of the second element is collapsed into the bottom margin of the first element. This is what we call margin collapsing. So technically, you should use the margin property to separate elements and the padding property to add space between the border and the content area of an element. This is the right way to use these properties. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of weird issues in your layouts. So that's all about the box model. Next, we're going to talk about sizing elements.